one of those cushions there. Okay, so welcome everybody. So unlike most of the talks or most of the meetings we've been doing so far, this one is largely about like theory. It's largely about history. So history is very important actually, because I've been having chats with some people, and history plays a role in our Buddhist practice because it forms views that lie in the background of our minds that are sometimes unquestioned. Because they're unquestioned, they're more powerful. As you grow up in a place and you're used to the environment, you're used to the temperature, and you don't even notice it. It's just part of your world. And so it's when we go back into history and we look for where these views came from, we look at the events that happened in history, then we can learn to better question our present. We can learn to better question the views that we have and the values that we have. So, I was chatting with our friend here, we're both into history. It has all the action in it of an action movie, but it also has the depth of a philosophical discourse. So today we're going to jump into the history of Sri Lanka. And one of the reasons is because Sri Lankan history actually for quite some time was Theravada history, more or less. It played a pivotal role in both Theravada and actually Mahayana Buddhism. That's something that many people don't know. We'll just touch on it briefly. It's the topic for another talk. But it was a repository of Buddhist knowledge for more than 1,000 years until Thailand and Burma both became Theravada. Now, in this time that Buddhism came to Sri Lanka, it was second only to India in the number of Arahants. So I think most of us here are Buddhists, some are not. So Arahant is the end goal of Buddhism. It's when, if a person achieves that, their suffering is finished. It's the whole point for which the Buddha taught. There's not really another point, another higher point for which he taught. So it's very important to evaluate, as we evaluate Buddhist history, to evaluate Arahantship. I mean, the statues, the artwork, the temples, they're impressive, they're important, they're inspiring, but the main reason that we have Buddhism is for Arahantship. So it makes sense that what we focus on is Arahantship in Buddhist history. So Sri Lanka, after India, was the country with the most Arahants in the Buddhist world. And the Buddhism arose in India at the time of the Buddha. That was when the most Arahants were. The Buddha was said to have 1,250 Arahant disciples, even within his lifetime. But after this, Buddhism came to Sri Lanka. In about 300 years, or 200 years after the Buddha's passing, a really great emperor arose in India. His name was King Ashoka. So, backing up, there was a bunch of different kings. And has anybody ever heard of Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli? There was a king that arose in India, and India was divided into all these like warring states, including Greeks. Greeks were right there on the border of India, and they had their own state. And this man came to power. His name was Chandragupta Maurya. Probably not that big of a state. But he had an advisor whose name was, I think, Kapila. Kapila was a Brahmin, and he wrote a book called the Artha Shastra, I think. It's may have got that name wrong, but it's essentially the Indian version of the Art of War. And it makes Machiavelli, apparently, look like a really friendly guy. So Chandragupta Maurya, with this Brahmin advisor that he had, began to systematically and ruthlessly conquer most of India. And as a result of these really ruthless policies, he expanded until he filled almost all of India, except for one part at the bottom. And by the way, India was bigger then than it is now. It included parts of Pakistan, and even maybe getting into Afghanistan and Iran a little bit. I haven't looked at a map of his empire, but it was bigger. Definitely Pakistan was part of it. So he had a son, and his grandson, his name was Ashoka, King Ashoka. So King Ashoka, when he came to power in this very competitive, very ruthless environment, what did he decide to do? He wanted to conquer the very smallest tip that was still left in India. So that's what he did. Okay. But it was easier said than done. He actually was a huge loss of life, I think both on his side and on the side of this small country, which was called Kalinga. So after conquering the whole of India, basically became an emperor in the sense his empire was huge. Even the Greeks were afraid of him. Then he became very disturbed by what he'd done and actually ended up going what seems to have been a truly sincere conversion to Buddhism. After converting to Buddhism, he reversed his policies of violent expansion and tried to emulate what in the suttas we call a Chakravarti. A Chakravarti is this wheel-turning monarch who they rule their realm without force. So he tried to emulate them in every way. And actually, he was almost wiped from Buddhist history, from history in India. That's a whole other topic. But you can still see these Ashokan pillars at widely flung places in India with this kind of like lion capital. It's a testament to his power, which was immense. And you see some of the scale of the stupas, these things that he constructed. They're much larger than they were in later centuries. Right? His power was not matched. But he decided that he didn't want to be a ruthless ruler like his grandfather. He wanted to rule by the Dhamma. And so what he did was he decided, instead of conquering by the sword, I'm going to conquer by the Dhamma. So you can imagine that his enemies in neighboring states were pretty happy to hear that. So rather than sending armies into neighboring states, he sent missionaries. They called them, Dhamma-dutas, messengers of the Dhamma. And so he sent them into Pakistan. He sent them a bunch of different places. The ones that we probably know best are arguably what's Thailand, Burma, and Sri Lanka. So he sent his own son to Sri Lanka. And carrying with him, he took what we call the Buddhist Tipitaka. There was a bunch of different Indian Buddhist schools at the time, but Ashoka favored this one called the Vibhajavadins. So it's their Abhidhamma, it's their commentaries that we inherit now. Before there was 18 different Buddhist schools. But King Ashoka sent them to Sri Lanka with his son Mahinda. So Mahinda came to Sri Lanka, he gets to the island, and he meets the king of Sri Lanka on a hunting expedition. The king's name was Tissa. So he met him on the hunting expedition and he called him by name. He said Tissa, which you don't say to the king. So if you call the king by name, you get killed. So it was a very kind of shocking thing. And often in the kind of annals, you might say, of Buddhist history, it comes across because he's a monk, he got away with it. And there may have been some of that. He was a very special monk, one who'd finished the path and one who had immense charisma, but also he was the son of the most powerful emperor that area maybe had ever known. He even surpassed his grandfather. So there was good incentive as well to convert to Buddhism rather than being conquered. But King Devanampiya Tissa embraced this new religion, the religion of Buddhism, and he seems to have been very, very sincere, actually. So Mahinda came and established what we now call the Mahavihara that was given to him in Sri Lanka. And the very first converts were some of the king's own ministers. One of them was named Arita. So they were the very first people to want to ordain. And Arita was said to have achieved Arahantship while his head was being shaved, waiting for his ordination. So that begins the history of Sinhalese Arahants. He was the very first Sinhalese Arahant, and legend has it, he dwelled in the very first Sinhalese Aranya. After this, many, many Arahants arose in Sri Lanka. So there's stories of Sri Lanka. When you go to Sri Lanka, if you ask people, are there any caves around here, anything like this, they say, yes, there's the places where Arahants used to live. So this is how they remember it culturally. And they say it about any cave. If it has a drip legend like Arahan Wahanse Hitaputena, that means the place where Arahants used to live. So the number of Arahants in this very early phase multiplied quite quickly. And interestingly enough, the Buddha had a prophecy that the true Dhamma would last only 500 years. The true Dhamma here means Dhamma unadulterated, where all the bhikkhus agreed basically on what the Dhamma was and what it wasn't. Interestingly enough, about 500 years after the Buddha's passing away, his parinibbana, new sutras composed by disciples started to become accepted as authoritative. And this was the beginning of what we call the adulteration. We can call the adulteration of the true Dhamma. So in this period, when King Ashoka came, or when Mahinda came to Sri Lanka, it was still the period where the true Dhamma was strong. And so there were many, many Arahants almost coming on the momentum of the Buddha. and the momentum of his great disciples that had come from India. After King Devanampiya there were a few more kings, and then we come to what's widely regarded as Sri Lanka's greatest king, who was named King Dutu. Could you pass me that cushion? This actually, I've got some cold problems with my feet. I think this will make it a little, this cotton, okay. So, King Dutu, for those who like English history, he's pretty similar to King Arthur. King Arthur had the Knights of the Round Table, and, oh, we're all supposed to turn our phones off. Look at this. I'll just leave it ringing. So King Arthur had his Knights of the Round Table, and King Dutu actually had these like 6 or 7 or 8 what they called giants. These kind of giants they almost all had these like special powers individually. So one was really good at archery, another one had this like really special ability to kick, and each of them had this like very special ability. So they were a bit like King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table. So he fought a war against a Tamil invader that came, whose name was Ilara. So King Ilara is kind of this archetype. He came in from southern India, and he'd conquered Anuradhapura. The interesting thing about Sinhalese history is that they give him quite a lot of reverence, actually, King Ilara. They portray him as this king who's kind of virtuous, he had these very strong morals, but they didn't like him because he was a foreigner, and they didn't like him, apparently, because he was not Buddhist. Now, just backing up historically, this is something that's really interesting to me because I thought South India was Buddhist at that time. For a long time, South India was Buddhist, and I thought that at this time they would be, but apparently the king who came was not Buddhist, so they didn't like him. So the big kind of war that's remembered as like the most virtuous, valiant period in Sri Lanka's history, you have King Dutu coming up to Anuradhapura, and King Ilara coming out to meet him, and he also had these like champions who had like really special powers. And King Dutu challenges King Ilara to a one-on-one elephant battle, rather than having their armies battle. And they're battling, they have these things, and he ends up killing him, kind of slaying him in single combat. After this, Sri Lanka enters into what's basically its golden age, the golden age of Buddhism in Sri Lanka. And he makes Anuradhapura this very kind of important holy site. And he builds what's called the Ruanvelli Mahasaya. If anybody's ever been to Sri Lanka, it's the most famous stupa in Sri Lanka. And Anuradhapura, the way that it was constructed, actually probably became the second most holy place in Buddhism in the world, after the Buddha's 4 holy sites in India. He also constructed this, what they call this brazen palace. If anybody's ever been to Anuradhapura, some of these ruins are really impressive. So you've got this kind of like almost field with, I don't know, it must be 40, 50, 60, I can't even count them, just huge numbers of these stone pillars. And I was walking by it and I was like, what on earth is this thing? So apparently what it was the lower level of a 9-story ancient high-rise. And so they put all these pillars and then do something with the floor. I don't know how they built the floor, but you should see their stonework. It's incredible. And they built it to 9 levels. So it would have been like a high rise. And the legend has it that the topmost level at the opening ceremony, only Arahants could go there. Maybe like the top 2 levels, the next 2 were Anagamis, the next 2 were Sakadagamis, the next lowest ones were Sotapannas, and then the rest of the monks. So what it means, we can't confirm or deny this for sure, but it means that there was this very strong cultural memory of huge numbers of Arahants existing in Sri Lanka. It wasn't a kind of abnormal thing. It was kind of a normal thing. After King Dutu time, this was the kind of golden age of Sri Lanka, but it wasn't going to last. Before long, Sri Lanka would start to face what would be one of its major challenges, and actually a major challenge in the world of Theravada Buddhism. It was about 80 years after that. There was a couple different kings, and a king came to the throne whose name was Vatagamani. Vatagamani came to the throne, and almost immediately he got challenged. This Brahmin who'd gotten a prophecy that he should be king sent him a message and said, give me your parasol, give me your king's paraphernalia, which means I'm going to be king. At the same time, 7 Tamil leaders landed on the southern part, in the northern part, I think, of Sri Lanka, and sent the king a message and said, give me your parasol, we're going to be king. So the king, being a little bit crafty, he sent a message to this Brahmin and said, look, if you can beat these Tamil leaders, you're going to be king. So the Brahmin started a war with these Tamil leaders, and he came to be known as Chandalatissa. So, as far as I remember, Chandala means outcast. It's like the worst insult you can call somebody in South Asian culture. It basically means you can't be touched. It's one of the most terrible insults. And one of the reasons appears to be, remember that name because it's going to come into what we talk about later, and I'll also bring it up again. What he appeared to do was basically start this war and destroy a lot of the irrigation networks in Sri Lanka, in Anuradhapura. So if anybody's ever been to Anuradhapura, it's basically like a desert. Like they have these huge earthworks. Like I went there, I couldn't tell the difference. I thought it was a lake. They have these huge, huge bodies of water, and they've constructed these immense, called wevas or reservoirs, because it's such a dry area. So this fellow destroyed these reservoirs, destroyed the dams, and at the same time a drought hit. Same time they got a drought as these wars started. So people started dying off. And the king, after they defeated this Brahmin, these group of 7 invaders came and fought the king, and they beat him. So this king Vatagamani started running, and he had to actually drop one of his queens off and keep going, and with his other queen. And he met a monk, which would be a very, very fateful event in Sri Lankan history, and not in a good way. So monks have these rules where we can't give food that we've received from lay people to another lay person. But you can give leftovers that you've received from lay. If you've eaten, you have leftovers, you can give them away to lay people. So this monk, he took a few bites of food and then gave the rest of his food to the fleeing king. And then what he did, apparently he had a servant, he told the king he could go hide out in his servant's house, hidden and unknown as to who he was. So the king went there and lived with this servant, with his queen, unknown to the population. In the meantime, these invaders started fighting amongst themselves and killing themselves, and finally there was only like one left. And about 14 years had passed in this kind of famine situation. So the king, the history is a little bit funny. his wife, the queen, she was like coming out of this servant's house, and the servant's wife came out, and apparently they had some like laundry baskets or something. And like the servant's wife hit the queen with the laundry basket, maybe accidentally, and it caused this huge uproar. So then the servant man, who I think didn't know it was a king, came out with his bow, like ready to kill his wife. And so then the king announced who he was. I'm Vatagamani, King Vatagamani. And he gathered this army of ministers. This huge number of people came around to support him. So unfortunately, the king was quite arrogant. So this shows you what kings were like in that time. So he was getting ready for war, and he saw one of his ministers coming up the stairs, and the minister didn't throw himself down to pay homage to the king. So the king killed him. And then the rest of the ministers got really angry at this. Like, well, like, how are you going to kill our friend? So they left and got all upset. Now the king's kind of alone again. He doesn't have an army. So what happened was another monk interceded, and he asked these ministers, who do you think is going to foster Buddhism, the invaders or the king? And they said, the king's going to foster Buddhism. And so as a result, he was able to get the king back together with his army. So the king gets his army, he goes back to Anuradhapura, beats the last remaining Tamil leader. And what he did next was quite fateful. He built basically a new monastery. But monasteries in the time of the Buddha and in the canon are always recommended to be donated basically to the Sangha as a whole. But instead of donating the monastery to the Sangha as a whole, he donated it to the monk who gave him alms food. And the Sangha didn't like this. So the Sangha, what they did after that, there's these procedures that you can do to cut people off of the Sangha. There's one called suspension, and they suspended this monk. You're no longer part of our fraternity. It's a really harsh penalty, actually. There's a lot of things that go with it. You can't stay under the same roof as a regular monk. You can't perform the same patimokkha, the same rituals with regular monks. You're basically cut off. So they did this to this monk because of the king. And that monk's student got really upset. He joined that other monk, and then they got followers, and they started a schism in the Buddhist Sangha that lasted for more than 1,000 years. And the name of that monastery was Abhayagiri. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this name before. Very famous monastery name. So that name will also be important later on. And what we'll see in the course of this story is that history really doesn't have clear heroes and villains. The split of the Sangha is villainous. The Mahavihara is the first established place of Theravada and Orthodoxy, and very soon they're going to play the role of the hero again. Because this famine, what it had done, it had wiped out so many monks that the actual Pali Canon was in danger of being lost. So until this time, monks had carried the Pali Canon around in their memories. And kind of, they had what they called Banaka dynasties. So you'd pass one portion of the Pali Canon on to your students, then you'd have another group who would memorize another portion. Sometimes they'd break up the Nikayas, like one portion would memorize this part of the Anguttara Nikaya, another one this. So if one gets lost, that's it for the Buddha Vachana. So because of this long, long famine, King Vatagamani sponsored a council that was basically presided over by the Mahavihara, and they wrote down the Pali Canon. That's why we have it today. If it wasn't for this writing, we wouldn't have it. Actually, a lot of the canons in India got lost. We have fragmentary pieces. And the other thing about the Pali canons that we have in India, they altered them. You can see this very clearly. They wrote things into the canon that weren't there. Whereas the canon that they kept in Sri Lanka, sometimes they disagreed with things in the canon, but they put it into commentaries. Now, these commentaries would later play a very important role. So we have a pretty good canon with the Pali Canon, and it's because of this king, who was both good and a little bit evil. So time went on, and after this, Buddhism continued on. And in about the 2nd century AD, Buddhism had grown, it had become the state religion, king after king had supported it. The institutions that had originally been the pioneers in Buddhism started to become corrupt. They started to become really, really wealthy. And actually, you can see their wealth. If you ever go to Anuradhapura, it's, what they built in those days is extremely impressive. So they became wealthy, they became lax in their practices, and another split started to occur. But this split was between monks who study and monks who practice. And it was a very, very bitter divide. So the split that started to occur, and this is where it's interesting, it didn't occur from the Orthodox Theravadins. It occurred from the heterodox Abhayagiri community. And Abhayagiri by this time was not Theravada. They started to become Mahayana. And not just Mahayana, they were like Tibetan Buddhists. So you often think of Sri Lanka as this like monolith Theravadan country where it preserved the Theravada doctrine. At that time, Mahayana was probably stronger in Sri Lanka than Theravada was. This Abhayagiri Vihara, they actually had the Buddha's begging bowl, and they had one of the most important relics in Sri Lanka, which was the tooth relic. It was in their possession. So even when we read about the pilgrims who came to Sri Lanka, Huang San and Fahin, they say that Abhayagiri had 5,000 monks. The Mahavihara basically had 3,000. I can't remember which one said this. And then the third one, Jetavana, split from Abhayagiri. That had, I think, 2,000. And Jetavana was also Mahayana. By the way, as a kind of interesting little aside, I've kind of gone walking among these places. And it was during Corona time one time, and I was walking by the Jetavana Vihara. And they have this museum. So usually it costs money, but nobody was there because it's Corona. And I was a monk, so they're like, come in. So I went into this museum of this vihara, and the statues that they have are like, they're like these like half-naked women, like with, like half scantily dressed women that are like standing like this. And I was like, what are they doing in this vihara? Like, why do they have a statue like this in the vihara? So I was asking the people who are the curators, like, how are the monks practicing when they have statues like this? That's the kind of question that came to my mind. And they're like, well, this was a kind of Mahayana vihara, Jetavana was. So not only were they Mahayana, some of these were Tantrayana. And Tantrayana was a step up from Mahayana. Mahayana introduced this doctrine of skillful means, where you break the precepts for the greater good. Tantrayana introduced this doctrine where you use your defilements to attain enlightenment. And they started doing some crazy stuff. You can see why they'd have a statue there. And when you put these two together, Abhayagiri at 5,000 and Jetavana at 2,000 or 3,000, you get a picture of what the landscape was like in medieval Sri Lanka with Buddhism. It was mainly Mahayana. Theravada was smaller. So a debate arose among these monks. But from this Mahayana kind of enclave, a split occurred. And this split was a sect that probably, from what I've been able to see, quite possibly arose in the 2nd century AD. And their name was the Pamsakulikas. So I don't know if anybody's ever heard of this sect. I hadn't heard of them either. But when I went to Sri Lanka, there's places still very deep in the forest. Extremely inspiring. Like you can't stay there past 4 p.m. sometimes. The people tell you to leave because elephants will overrun the place. And huge trees. And all of these places have this really special feel. I was like, what were the monks doing here? Like, who were these monks who lived in this place? And the monasteries are sculpted out of these stone blocks that are huge. You should see the size of the scale of the buildings they built. It's just immense. And they don't have any Buddha statues. That's one interesting thing. No Buddha statues, no Bodhi trees, just plain but very beautifully done stone. And these were the Pamsakulikas. You can find these ruins spread from Anuradhapura down to the furthest south areas of Sri Lanka, like Situpawa. Sometimes there's even ones that people don't know were there. I didn't know there was one like really close to the monastery that I was staying. But they all have these really peculiar features that are mysterious. They've got these staircases. They always have a really central staircase. Sometimes they have these like roundabouts where you'll be walking down this really well laid out path and there'll be this circle. And you're like, why do they have this? And they would lead to these structures they call padangaras. And you can see them in Anuradhapura and in these ancient forest monasteries. Are these 2 raised, like very well done, very high usually, edifices that are connected by a central staircase. And nobody knows what they were used for. I've gone and asked people, like, what were these things used for? And nobody seems to, that was where the monks lived. It's like, well, why did they build a second one next to it that doesn't have any buildings on it? It's like, it just doesn't make sense, but they're obviously a central feature. This sect was the one, they were called Pamsakulikas, that rebelled against the excesses that were occurring in the Mahaviharas. And although the whole sect, all of the things in their monasteries were not decorated, there's one thing that was really well decorated, and that was their urinals. And you know what they decorated their urinals with quite often? Pictures of what they originally thought were palaces. But later, many people think they were viharas. The rich viharas, they carved in exquisite detail in their urinals so that when they went pee, guess where they were peeing? Onto these viharas. So you get a sense of how intense this debate was. It wasn't kind of a normal debate. Now, into this scene, another really, really pivotal, really, really important event happened in Sri Lankan history that would shape all of Theravadan history for a long time. From India, from South India, a monk who probably originated in Bihar, possibly, came to Sri Lanka looking for the commentaries on the texts, because Mahinda had brought with him these ancient commentaries and translated them into Sinhalese. And Buddhism in India by that time had started to decline, and these commentaries were only available in Sri Lanka. So he came to Sri Lanka looking for these commentaries, and first they made him have a test before he could access the commentaries. They gave him a very short verse and said, write a book or write a response to this verse. So he did, and that book is what we now know as the Visuddhimagga. So he wrote this book, and legend has it that they hid it, and then he wrote it a second time. Then the Devas or somebody hid it a second time, so he wrote it a third time. And then they hid it again, and they got them all together, and they presented these 3 documents to the leaders of the Mahavihara, and they cross-checked them and saw that there wasn't a single difference between them. That's the legend. Because of this book, the Visuddhimagga, the Mahavihara monks gave Venerable Buddhaghosa access to the ancient Sinhalese commentaries. And what he did was he took these ancient Sinhalese commentaries and he translated them into Pali. We know that he added a lot of things to these commentaries because he mentions Theras that are in Sri Lanka in the commentaries. These commentaries altogether are called the Atthakatha, which basically means the elucidator of meaning. Atta means like meaning, kata means like story, or you can take it as elucidator. And this Atthakatha formed the framework by which Theravada Buddhism was interpreted for a long, long time. And it still does. Now, buried in this Atthakatha is a very interesting story that goes to the heart of this debate. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's buried in a commentary to the Anguttara Nikaya, but I'll give a kind of synopsis. And this is how it starts. These 5 kinds of disappearance are rooted, or not starts, but this is one of the portions where it comes to the story. These 5 kinds of disappearance are rooted only in the disappearance of learning, because learning's disappearance is the disappearance of practice. When learning endures, practice remains. Even on this island, there was a great disaster known as Chandalatissa, the Great Fear. Do you remember Chandalatissa? Which happened maybe 600 years ago, something like this, from the time that this was composed. So, Saka, the king of the gods, having constructed a great raft for the bhikkhus, foretold of the great fear that would befall. The rain deva will not pour down proper rainfall. The bhikkhus will become weary due to shortness of requisites. They will not be able to bear in mind their learning. It is proper for you, masters, to protect your lives having gone to the other shore, which is India. Having ascended this great raft, you must go, venerable sirs. For those who are here, it is not possible to stay, not adequate. For you, having set aside, even like a plank on the chest, you should use that plank to cross over to India, so that this entire fear, which is this famine, will be avoided. Then, having reached the ocean shore, 60 monks went to India, and apparently the rest of the monks stayed in Sri Lanka during this time, which we already talked about, right? This kind of really great famine. This is what's written in the Atthakatha. So then it goes on to say that after these monks, well, first of all, I should back it up. This is what's written in the Pali, and not everybody translates it. It said those monks went to India, and they basically, as far as I remember, stayed in Sri Lanka, and they recited the Atthakatha. And not only did they recite the Atthakatha, they recited the Tipitaka. But they mentioned, as far as I remember, I kind of went through and translated some of this, they mentioned the Atthakatha twice and the Tipitaka once. So it's like they went to these different places and they recited the Atthakatha, which just conveniently is where this story is written. Then they come back to Sri Lanka after this great disaster has happened, and they compare notes. And they recite together what they've lost, the monks who went to India, the monks who were there. And they find that not even a single syllable is missing in the recitation of the Atthakatha and of the Tipitaka, which means the Atthakatha is really, really authoritative. Now, at this time, they're putting this way back into the time when there was this great famine. And it goes on to say, the bhikkhus got together in Mandalarama, which I think means that place where they actually ended up writing down the Tipitaka. So now you're in the most intense phase of Buddhist history where the Tipitaka is almost lost. And what happens next? Let's do some reading. A second here. Okay. Having gone to the elders with the 3 Pitakas purified, indeed they did not see even one syllable not in agreement. For the elders in that place, this talk arose. Is learning or practice the root of the dispensation? The Pamsakulika elders, and we're talking about the Pamsakulikas, who arose in the 2nd century AD probably, said, practice is the root. The Dhamma speaker said, learning is the root. Then all of the many elders there said, even for you two we will not make a person victorious by speech alone. You must bring forth quotes from the suttas to gain victory by what is spoken. Then the Pamsakulika elder said, to bring forth a quote from the suttas is not a burden. Then they brought forth this quote. But Subhadra, if the bhikkhus dwell rightly, the world will not be empty of arahants. Practice is the root of the teacher's dispensation, O great king. So now they have maybe King Vatagamani there. It is its essence. By practice, it persists, it remains. By the way, that is an actual quote from the Pali Canon, from the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. So then the Dhammakattika group goes. They brought forth these quotes from the sutta, the Pamsakulikas did. Having heard this sutta, the Dhamma speakers brought forth these verses from their own position. Now remember, they're supposed to bring forth a quote from the suttas. Here's what their verses were. For as long as Sutanta remains, as long as the Vinaya shines, for that long they see the light, just as the sun rises. In the Sutanta's non-existence and the Vinaya forgotten, the world will be in darkness, just as the sun's disappearance. Now these verses are very important that are about to come. Maybe we'll see if anybody can pick out the pattern. In the Sutanta being so protected, the practice comes to be protected. With the endurance of the practice, the wise ones released from attachments do not perish. When these verses were brought forth, the Pamsakulika elders became silent. Only the Dhamma speaker elders were first place. Indeed, just as between a breed of 100 or 1,000 bulls, there is not a single cow in that lineage, its succession is not going to be continued. So too, for a bhikkhu who has begun to win insight, even for 100 bhikkhus, even for 1,000 bhikkhus, if there is not the learning of the scriptures existing, indeed, there is not the noble path penetration. And just as a syllable put down on the surface of a stone to make known the location of a treasure pot, for as long as a syllable remains, indeed that long the treasure pot is not lost. Just so, as long as learning lasts, the dispensation does not disappear. So, there are a couple, or one major thing in this rendition found in the Atthakatha, written at the time of an intense debate between monks who study and monks who practice. There's a significant anomaly. That anomaly is that the Pamsakulikas did not exist at the time of King Vatagamani. They did not exist at the time of the Great Fear. They did exist at the time when the Atthakatha was being composed, in the very monastery that the Pamsakulikas possibly carved into their urinals to show their disdain for. So it's pretty convenient. Interestingly enough, in Sri Lankan history, they have a cultural memory of who their very last Arahant is. The very last Arahant was a monk named Maliyadeva. And there's many, many places that claim that he lived there. And indeed, he may have traveled around. So sometimes they put him in the time of Vatagamani, which is pretty improbable, because Vatagamani was like 60 years after the golden age of Arahantship in Sri Lanka. Sometimes they put him in like the 2nd century AD, which, might be possible. But I've actually visited some places that are associated with him. And there's one place that stands out as being more authentic, at least to me, than the others. And that is a monastery named Arahantship. Now, granted, I haven't visited 2 of these monasteries, but I have visited a lot of Pamsakulika monasteries because I was really inspired by them. Usually, these monasteries just have a single staircase leading up to these double platforms. Arahantship is really different. It's apparently a monastery that was given to Maliyadeva, the last Arahant. And there, instead of having this single staircase leading up to these mysterious double platforms, the main drag goes along the side of this actually quite beautiful mountain and ends up at this very, very ornately carved cave. And not only that, the usual walking meditation paths in those times were like these kind of flat, sandy areas. At Arahantship, they have this really huge raised one. Like it's very wide. It's one of the widest walking meditation paths I've seen kind of constructed, actually. We thought it was really short when we went to walk it, But it's actually pretty long. It just looks short because it's so wide, and it's clearly raised above the others. I've never seen that at another Pamsakulika monastery. Now, this monastery was supposed to have been donated to Malayadeva, the last Arahant, and the time when this monastery was probably the 6th century AD, not long after this fateful debate. The last Arahant in Sinhalese folklore breathed his last. So in Buddhism, we have this teaching coming from the Buddha that the dispensation doesn't disappear from something like a war, doesn't disappear from something like an attack. It disappears from worthless men who arise right here in the dispensation. The purpose for which the Buddha laid down his doctrine is the attainment of Arahantship. And it's not just for the preservation of the words in the suttas. Now, to add insult to injury, I'll read one last thing that's in the Atthakatha. Well, I'll say some more about the Atthakatha. This is what they say about Malayadeva in the Atthakatha. Actually, I had to go look this up. For some who study, recite, teach, explain, and elucidate the scriptures as described, the defilements do not find an opportunity to arise. They are merely suppressed by the scriptural study. Thus, having suppressed them, one can eliminate them and attain arahantship like the elder Malayadeva. So now the very last arahant in Sri Lanka, according to the Atthakatha, didn't even practice meditation. He just spent all of his time studying and attained arahantship. Now this actually goes even deeper, unfortunately. I went to visit a temple. And some of these things, I haven't read the whole Atthakatha. I've done some research into it. But I went to visit this temple, and they one monk wanted to ask me questions and interview me. And he was, more on the study side, and, most of my life I've been a little bit more on the meditation side. So he wanted to, ask questions for his PhD thesis. And I said, okay, let's go. And he was senior to me. And if you're a senior monk in Buddhism, you have a lot of privileges. The Buddha made it quite clear that the most senior monk is to get the best seat, the most senior monk is to be the most respected, the most senior monk is to have all these things. So when we went to the room, I tried to put him in the senior monk seat, and also the chief monk was there. And he said, you sit in the prominent seat. And I was like, what do you mean? I'm not senior, he's senior to me. And the other monk was like, yeah. And they're like, yeah, in the Atthakatha, there's this word. I can't remember the word they said. I've got to go look it up. But essentially what it means is in the Atthakatha, they came up with another commentary, which said, it's no longer the senior monk who gets the best place. It's the one who's most skilled. And guess in what they're most skilled? In the Tipitaka. So now the meditation monks have lost even their seniority in the Atthakatha. And to add insult to injury, the Buddha's dispensation is said to disappear. The Atthakatha came up with a schema for its disappearance, whereby the ability to achieve arahantship would disappear in 1,000 years, and then anagami in another 1,000, and another 1,000, etc. In the Burmese tradition, they disappear in 500-year increments, and then in the middle, they get rebooted and then disappear again. But if it's no longer possible to attain arahantship by practicing, what's left to do? Study the Atthakatha. Study the vast volumes of Buddhist literature that came long after the Buddha, the Abhidhamma being one of them. Things that you could spend your whole life studying, your whole life memorizing, and never spend a moment practicing. So this is the cause. This is the reason. This is the calamity that befell Sri Lanka that, as far as I'm aware of, is not talked about. It's not generally known. Buried in the pages of the Atthakatha is the true story of what happened. If one can collate the history, it's clear enough. What happened was the debate between the monks who practice and the monks who study took a turn in which the monks who practice were thoroughly defeated. And that defeat was to last a long time. After this happened, Thailand and Burma were actually originally Mahayana, And Burma, in about the 9th century, they became fully Theravada. Their king converted to Theravada. And Thailand, in I think the 13th century, fully converted to Theravada. Sri Lanka, now you remember, it had all these, had a huge Mahayana influence. Mahayana was probably the main religion in the Middle Ages, Sri Lanka, 4th or 5th century up to the 10th century. And what happened in the 10th century, there was all these different invasions. The capital got moved to a place called Polonnaruwa, and a very great king, a very powerful king named King Parakramabahu arose. And what King Parakramabahu did, first of all, he reunited all of Sri Lanka with military might. He conquered southern India and forced them to pay tribute. And I think he conquered part of Burma too. It was just kind of like military genius. And the other thing that he did with all this power was he gave an ultimatum to the monks at Abhayagiri and Jetavana and said, you have two choices. Either you disrobe and become a layperson, or you become a samanera under the authority of the Mahavihara. And then he proceeded to burn all of the books in Jetavana, in Abhayagiri, all of their doctrines, to the extent we have no idea really what the Pamsakulikas practice today. This is why I showed up at these monasteries and was how come nobody's written what they practice? Like they have these huge, huge monasteries. Where's the writing about how they meditated? That's what I was interested in. So that's why. So after the unification of the three Buddhist schools under the Theravada, Sri Lanka again was the strongest place for Theravada Buddhism. And where did Thailand, where did Burma draw their Theravada Buddhism from? From Sri Lanka. So this doctrine of study and not practice was spread throughout the Theravada world, to the extent that actually, even I remember as a young man, I was attracted to Theravada. I wanted to learn meditation in those days. I could not find a Theravada temple that taught it. It's because of this. This is the cultural reason for these things. I mean, temples might not always teach, but there was a Zen temple that was teaching plenty of meditation that I went to. So, what does the Buddha actually say about the balance between study and practice? This is an important question. There's a few suttas in which the Buddha lays this out. And one of the important ones that we have to take to mind, this is a very acrimonious debate, monks peeing on, effigies of viharas and other monks kind of, making up lies in their commentarial text to defeat their opponents. And what we have to remember is in that the canon, it's actually a much more conciliatory tone between study and practice. There's a sutta with a monk named Chunda, and he admonishes the monks. This problem existed at that time. He says, the bhikkhus who practice criticize the monks who study, and the monks who study criticize the monks who practice, and as a result, neither of them shines. This is what he says. He says, instead, if you're a monk who practices, you should think, it's a gain for me that I have these companions in the holy life who can penetrate subtle words of great meaning. And he says for the monks who study, they should think it's a gain for me that I have these companions in the holy life who touch the deathless elements with their body. So in other words, the attitude that monks should have towards their fellow monks is one of praise, one of looking at their good qualities. And there's plenty of places in the canon where the Buddha mentions that you should go and learn the suttas, you should go and learn the matakas from monks who are knowledgeable. So it's not to say that we should just throw study out the window. It's very important for the longevity of the dispensation, and there's suttas about that. However, the most explicit suttas that deal with the proportion that we should devote to study and practice are called the Dhamma-Viharan suttas. And these suttas address the issue head on. They say, there's monks who learn the suttas, learn the mixed prose, question and answers, learn the matakas basically, and they spend their day in learning. They neglect seclusion, they neglect the duties of seclusion, they neglect devotion to the higher mind. This is called a monk absorbed in learning, not a monk who dwells in the Dhamma. There's another case where a monk learns the teachings, mixed prose and verse, question and answers, sometimes the matakas, I can't remember if that's in there. And he neglects seclusion. He neglects his training in the higher mind. This is called a monk devoted to teaching, not a monk who dwells in the Dhamma. Now, there's another case where a monk learns the mixed prose and verses, learns these things. He devotes his day to reciting. This is called a monk devoted to reciting, not a monk who dwells in the Dhamma. And finally, there's a monk who does all these things and devotes his day to thinking about the meanings of the Dhamma. This is called a monk who's devoted to pondering, not a monk who dwells in the Dhamma. So what is a monk who dwells in the Dhamma? It's a monk who learns the suttas, the mixed prose and verse, the question and answer sessions, even the matakas, but he is not negligent. He doesn't neglect the duties of solitude. He devotes himself to the higher mind. And the second one is the higher wisdom. That's a monk who dwells in the Dhamma. Then the Buddha says, Bhikkhus, I have taught you the monk devoted to learning. I've taught you the monk devoted to teaching. I've taught you the monk devoted to reciting. I've taught you the monk devoted to pondering. Over there are the roots of trees, bhikkhus. Over there are empty huts. Meditate and do not be negligent. This is our instruction to you. This is how the Buddha lays out how monks should live their life. So as far as our lessons for the future, that's one of the most important pieces because, as myself and our friend here were chatting about, history has a tendency to repeat itself. Actually, even within the Sutta Pitaka, there's a sutta called, I think it's in the Aganya Sutta, and in that sutta, it says, it talks about the devolution of humanity from Brahmas. And there's one, I think, said in there with the devolution where the monks stop studying. They used to live in leaf huts. Then they start memorizing. And they say, formerly practicing was higher. Now memorizing is higher. And they say, these ones do not meditate. So they have all these kind of like etymologies for like what a katya is. So that's how they kind of classify them. So even in the Buddha's time in the suttas, they were warning about this decline. Now what ended up happening further on in Theravada Buddhism, it's not the end of a sad story. For reasons that we cannot say, that are hard to know, but that are real, because they happened, in all three Theravada countries, for some strange reason, 2,500 years after the Buddha's parinibbana, there was a very strong revival in the practice of the Vinaya and in the practice of meditation. In Thailand, it was led by Ajahn Mun and Ajahn Sao. In Burma, it was led by Ledi Sayadaw and his disciples. And in Sri Lanka, especially, was influenced by the Ramanya Nikaya, and especially this very small but powerful subgroup called the Galdua, which has very, very good standards of Vinaya and are quite and have many impressive qualities. Independently, this happened in all three places. So when we look at Buddhist history, we're living in a time that's very, very rare, actually. You were born 300 years ago, you're born in the time when this view held sway. When you go to a temple and you get told, don't bother to practice, make donations and circumambulate the stupa and light lamps and hope to be born with Maitreya Buddha, because that's how you're going to achieve Nibbana. We're born in a time now where there are monks living, who have lived, who have achieved the goals that exist in the canon. And so the thing to be heedful of is history repeating itself. Because whenever practice becomes successful, wealth follows. And when wealth follows, practice becomes difficult. When practice becomes difficult, study becomes tempting. And when study becomes the main thing, when practice dies, that is the death of Arahantship. Not just in Sri Lanka, but wherever this pattern repeats itself. So the lessons that we can take away are we're very lucky. We have the opportunity to practice right now, and also that we should be very heedful so that this history doesn't repeat itself again in modern times. Okay, so that's some of the research that I did. So, thought to open up the floor for any questions or comments. Any questions? Okay. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know whether this is an appropriate question, but are there any Arahants now?
Yeah.
There are.
Yeah.
But there's no way of knowing.
Monks have a backstage pass. You tend to hear the rumors. Well, if you're in any profession, you hear the kind of rumors. But yeah, no, there isn't really a way for somebody to like directly look at somebody and say this person's an Arahant. But you can go and you can meet, and you can see the way that the monks are practicing, and you can have very little doubts in your mind after that. Whether or not you can confirm it exactly is very difficult, but you can confirm for yourself whether or not you're an Arahant, which ends up being the most important. But we should have faith that so long as monks put forth effort in their practice, like the Pamsakulika said, then the path to Arahantship will never be lost. There's nothing that should stop somebody who puts the causes that the Buddha laid down into place from getting the results. That's something we should have faith in. So there's places where there's large numbers of monks putting the causes into place. Why shouldn't the results follow there? At least that kind of logic can help to buoy the mind.
So this decline is not because of the Mahayana or Theravada or tantric differences. It's mainly stemming from the practice and then the not doing practice kind of a...
Yeah, well, classically part of the decline is from the invention of later texts that, first of all, like I think I mentioned, the later texts use this doctrine of upaya to say you can break the precepts. Then they get even more blatant, and it's like, do evil things. So that is a clear decline. That's one aspect. In Sri Lanka, that was not the primary cause. That was not what led to the death of Arahantship. Actually, the monks who were the practitioners were from the tantric schools, right? They're from the Mahayana. They weren't from the Mahavihara necessarily, although I imagine there were some Theravada monks who were really practicing, but their main representation came from the Mahayana. So history is not clear that way. So in Sri Lanka, the main cause of the death of Arahantship was this debate that was falsified in the Atthakatha. And I would say further, the main cause of the death of Arahantship in Sri Lanka is the Atthakatha. The reverence for the Atthakatha, the belief in the Atthakatha, and the wrong views that are pretty easy to ferret out. It doesn't take a genius. I mean, you just compare it to what the Buddha said.
I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on Rahul, what the Buddha taught? Where does he fit into all of this?
I couldn't say, because I haven't read his book. I imagine it's a good one. And where it would fit in is, study is important. You have to know the doctrine to a certain extent, and it's individual how much you have to know. So a monk who writes a book that is a really good introduction to Buddhism, I mean, that's how people find out about it and start practicing. However, it's important to keep in mind, actually, let me go back over one thing. Now that we're here, there's something really important here. Did anybody notice the pattern in this line? In the Suttanta being so protected, the practice comes to be protected. With the endurance of the practice, the wise ones released from attachments do not perish. Did anybody notice a pattern here? Did you notice a pattern?
Detachment is the only way you could.
Yeah, that's correct. There's a pattern here, which comes to another doctrine that's now... I didn't question this doctrine. This is why it shocked me when I read this. I was like, this was in the back of my head and I didn't know it. What they're describing here, in the Suttanta being so protected, the practice comes to be protected. What comes first? Pariyatti. The practice comes to be protected. What comes second? Patipatti. Third, with the endurance of the practice, the wise ones released from attachments do not perish. What comes third? Pativeda. Has anybody ever heard this before? Pariyatti, Patipatti, Pativeda. That's the path to enlightenment. It may very well come from these verses that were used to defeat the practice of Arahantship. So that's another thing that should be questioned, is this doctrine of Pariyatti, Patipatti, Pativeda. So Pariyatti, the balance is really important to keep in mind. It doesn't have to be that much. Actually, there's a sutta where in the Anguttara Nikaya, which is generally called acumen in English translations, in Bodhis, Bhikkhu Bodhis, and a monk approaches the Buddha and says, "Who is a learned expert on the Dhamma?" And the Buddha says, "Your question is excellent, monk, because you've asked who's a learned expert on the Dhamma." And the Buddha says, if a monk learns a 4-line stanza and practices in line with it, that's enough for him to be called a learned expert on the Dhamma. So the proportion here of pariyatti does not have to be that great. So for a monk like Venerable Walpola Rahula, who's written a really good book that's introduced people to Buddhism, that's great. I mean, that's his role. He's introduced a lot of people to Buddhism. In terms of this debate, it doesn't really have a direct bearing unless people think, well, I should keep studying more and more and more and more until I practice. That's where it would have a bearing if there's this false idea that's embedded in people's psyche coming from this historical circumstance.
Yeah, I just
Question?
want to ask, yeah, thanks for the talk. So I'm just trying to understand, like, why did, when this debate arose, the positions were so extreme, it seems like.
Oh, yeah.
So was it that, you shouldn't meditate at all? Did they think meditation is harmful?
No, well,
How did they come up, to such an extreme view that you shouldn't practice when it contradicts so many of the Tripitaka?
They were more subtle than that. They didn't say you shouldn't practice. They said practice is the most important. Then they came up with doctrines that you can become an Arahant just reading the suttas. Then they came up with doctrines like, now the time for Arahantship is past. Then what else was the other? They came up with a whole bunch. So essentially what it was a mesh of different positions coming from the Atthakatha that destroyed practice. So it wasn't just one, like you shouldn't practice. I mean, it says here, after you study, you should practice, and after you practice is realization. But oftentimes in history and in teaching in general, it's not the words, it's the intention that holds sway in people's behavior. So the intention behind this was the defeat of practice, and it was successful. Regardless of the words. Some people who really espouse that pariyatti, patipatti, pativeda, they never get to the patipatti and pativeda. You can pariyatti all the way through the Abhidhamma, through the Atthakatha, and it'll take you most of your life probably. You should see how big these texts are.
So was it maybe the intention that the people who are studying a lot, just like a political power play?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
The head monks and the people wouldn't question them because they didn't have good meditation.
Well, this comes back to the rest of Sri Lankan Buddhist history, which is really intense. So this is part of an ancient history which was as intense as any other medieval warfare. So actually Abhayagiri and the Mahavihara had these kind of like back and forth wars where one king would like support the Mahavihara and almost really damage Abhayagiri. And there was, even kings who like supported Abhayagiri, they dismantled the Mahavihara. And then they used the stones from the Mahavihara to build a stupa in Jetavana. Like these kind of intense back and forth fights were happening. And this style of fight is reflective of that culture. This culture of extreme. When you get a lot of resources, sometimes that kind of thing happens. Like look at the political parties in the West, right?
So really the Buddhism that was sent by Ashoka to Sri Lanka was Theravada.
Yeah. It was
It
terrible.
got sort of mixed up and with people having arguments with each other, and it became Mahayana and Theravada, and then
Well, the Theravada one, they kept pretty well, actually. I mean, this is why history is not totally villains and heroes. We have the Tipitaka because of the Mahavihara. But it was probably because of the Mahavihara that they defeated practice. So they kept the Tipitaka really well. I mean, it's because of Sri Lanka that we have this good knowledge of the Buddha's teachings. Abhayagiri broke away in this schism, and then as a part of their schism, they eventually started adopting Mahayana coming from India, and then eventually Vajrayana. And they became most powerful, as I said.
And finally, again, the Theravada came above them, and now it's Theravada completely.
That's another historical circumstance because of the king who destroyed Mahayana so thoroughly, we don't even know what the Pamsakulikas taught. That, by the way, historically, that didn't have to happen. If that king didn't come, we might all be practicing. I might not be wearing Theravadan robes, right?
So really, it was by coming to Polonnaruwa by that king that the Theravada, he made sure that the Theravada was established once again.
Yeah, it was supreme. After that, there was no competition. And to this day in Sri Lanka, I mean, it's a Theravada country, right? Nobody talks about its Mahayana past, but it's there.
It was there.
Yeah, the past, its Mahayana past is there. It's a part of its history. Yeah.
even now, within the Theravada also there are various sects, right? And then there are different political denominations, promoting one side or the other, and it's no different to. Maybe it's not as intense as it was in the earlier times, but there are different chapters of the Buddhism at the moment in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, that's pretty mild compared to
Yeah.
what was. I mean, you can't expect humans to be 100% harmonious in any corporate body that they create. And there's always friction. So that's just the reality of humanity generally. And that's what we see reflected in Buddhism today. But Buddhism today is more stable, and the world in general is more stable, peaceful, prosperous than it has been for a long, long time. We're living in an extremely lucky time. I mean, not just in terms of Buddhism, in terms of external material wealth. Anybody who's a student of history, I mean, take a look at what it was like. We're really lucky. So this is the window that we have.
Auntie, can I ask a personal question?
We'll see.
You have gone to Sri Lanka. Now we have gone to Sri Lanka,
Uh-huh.
and I know that you are in Sri Lanka now.
Uh-huh.
Is it that you can do your Buddhism better in Sri Lanka, or the reason the atmosphere is better, or?
Yeah, well, Sri Lanka, I mean, it's an ancient Buddhist country, as we've seen. Like, things that are foundational things for practicing monks that are Australia is pretty good. I mean, it may be the number one, but go to other Western countries where Buddhism is just starting. I mean, it's really pioneer days. Like, we're talking about, laying the very basic frameworks for Buddhism. Like, monks are good, they're not lazy, monks provide a good service to people. Not having a job is good, living off of dana and teaching for free is good. Like, these are things that are not present in Protestant Christian cultures. So the opportunities that are available in Sri Lanka where these things are a given are much, much greater. I mean, I can go in Sri Lanka and walk to any forest. There's a kuti there, like you could and people want you to stay. They try to convince you not to leave. Like, no, don't leave, stay in our kuti, please stay. We want to offer dana. So, I mean, it's...
Offering dana is a plus point because we all, as you see a priest, we always think of dana,
Yeah.
So even the village people who are not that rich also, they want to give.
Yeah. So you have huge opportunities there. I mean, I've never seen these kind of opportunities in the West. The times that I've tried to do them, you can, but it's hard. Sri Lanka, the whole Sri Lanka, all the Sinhalese area is like a single monastery almost. Like the country is a monastery. You can you just go wherever you want. So that gives a lot of opportunities for practice. Western countries are also really excellent because Buddhism is new here. People are interested in practicing. So I think people in like Western countries generally are interested in the practice of Buddhism more than in the well-established Buddhist countries I've lived. So it's not like you can say one is, much better than the other. But if you're a monk who wants to live alone and practice meditation, Sri Lanka's the place.
Coming back to that question around the extreme case of practicing and just learning without any sort of practicing, isn't it the case that when you practice to a certain level that it becomes very subtle, that the learnings and the things which you take away from practice can become a bottleneck and a hindrance to those subtle levels? So is that the reason why that thing becomes harmful rather than those two extreme ends, no practice at all or 100% learning from Sutta? Is it because that when you get into a certain state of practice, that the learnings and whatever you gain from your peripheral thinking might become a hindrance?
If it's a wrong view, it can. if somebody has studied the Atthakatha, if they've studied the Abhidhamma. So actually in the course of this trip, meeting with kind of traditional Buddhists, one of the things that I've been emphasizing is that the purpose of our practice is not to know what ultimate reality is. The purpose of our practice is to eliminate our own suffering, to reduce our bad qualities and to increase our good qualities. So if somebody studies a text which tells you that this is really, really important, you should know what real ultimate reality is. And by the way, we've written it all down here. And then instead of looking for the qualities in your life that are negative or positive, trying to reduce the negative ones, trying to grow the positive ones, you start spending your time looking for an ultimate reality. You know, it's a sidetrack. So in that way, study is an obstacle. If you study the suttas have like a single flavor. It's the flavor of striving for nibbana. If you study those, and then you don't get stuck on study, you study them for the sake of learning what you should do next. And then after having come up with an idea about what you should do next, then you go and do it. In that way, study is a huge benefit. It's when it becomes something that's important in and of itself that it can turn into an obstacle, because actually humans exist in a kind of culture. So what happens if you're in a culture where people base their power around study, they actively try to stop monks from practicing. It's just a dynamic that exists in the human psyche. So in those ways, study can become an obstacle, but in the other way that I mentioned, it's an enormous benefit. I mean, we have to have the teachings of the Buddha. Yeah.
So, you mentioned the Jethavana monastery.
Yeah.
So I think, is the monastery now called Jethavana monastery? Is it the same one that exists currently? Is it like the successor of that monastery, or is it at the same site?
Oh, you're talking about this new movement or something? I don't know much about that monastery and its doctrines. Jethavana is now an archaeological site.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so all of old Anuradhapura is like the whole city. It's like a city of temples. It's an archaeological site.
Okay, so the one that's currently called Jethavana, it's not necessarily related at all.
No, Buddhism was basically lost in Sri Lanka during colonial era. The monastic ordination lineage was destroyed through the colonial efforts of the Portuguese and the Dutch. The British were kind of nicer, I think, but they were so intense that they actually reduced the Sangha to the point where they couldn't even get enough monks to ordain. So it basically died, and they had to re-import it from Thailand. Then they re-imported 2 other lineages from Burma later on because they wanted monks who were practicing.
And was that quite recent?
Yeah, pretty recent. Yeah, as I mentioned, all this is pretty recent.
The 19th century? Or?
I'm not so up on the history. I'd have to ask ChatGPT.
1950, that Burmese Buddhism came back to Sri Lanka.
Right, that was when the Galduos started, right?
Galdu is from the same lineage.
Yeah, from the Ramanya Nikaya. Yeah, to look it up.
I think the Jethavana you're talking about, it's regional in different location, I think.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the old Jethavana was more the northern area, Anuradhapura area, was it?
Yeah, yeah.
The one you're talking about is further south, middle of the country, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, it'd be new.
Yeah.
Question? Yeah.
Are there similarities between what is in Zen or Mahayana called emptiness and what is taught in the Buddhist teachings in the Pali canon?
Yeah. I mean, I started in Zen. I still believe that there's Arahants in Zen Buddhism. The lives that some of these monks live are exemplary. And when they die, they get cremated, their bones turn to relics. There's some, if you ever look up Kusan Sunim from the Korean tradition, he was really inspiring. So I believe he's an Arahant. And even in the tradition that I ordained in, the Thai tradition, there was a recognition, there's an Arahant in Korea.
What was his name?
His name was Kusan Sunim. But he probably wasn't the only one. They have a really strong practice tradition in Korea. The Mahayana kept their practice traditions. So they didn't get affected by this. They're still really practice-oriented, some of them. So as far as the similarities go, in Theravada, when we talk about emptiness, it's essentially, the Buddha talks about it on different levels. One level is empty of a self. Another is empty of defilements. But that type of emptiness goes quite deep, because the reason that we have defilements is because we construct a self, essentially. We construct an identity in the world of experience. And we don't see anything beyond the identity that we have in the world of experience. That's our whole world, that's reality. So essentially, if a person removes their defilements, then they've gone a step beyond reality. It's an emptiness that can't be described. So it's probably where Mahayana arose from. They were trying to find shortcuts some of the time. So they focused on koans and these other pithy phrases to try to give people a more direct way to attain this like emptiness. But that description would be in Theravada too, but more prosaic. That means empty of defilements. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Do you have a question?
I have a thought.
Mm-hmm.
To me, like getting to that point of emptiness,
Mm.
I don't know, for me it just sounds like so beyond me that when I think about it, it just sounds like someone would be drifting around like a ghost almost. It just kind of, it actually kind of scares me because I'm like, well, what do you do? What do you think? What do you say? Like what? It's just like it's like so beyond like what I can even imagine, because for me, even like sitting alone at home for half the day, I'm going crazy with anxiety. Like I need to go, I need to read something, I need to do something. I can't imagine doing that for like years and years and just being fine and smiling and not like having a mental breakdown. Because you're like an aimless ghost, like drifting through.
Well, imagine it this way. Do you have any bad habits that you don't like?
Yeah.
So imagine you got rid of that bad habit and now you were empty of it.
Yeah.
Would you be happier or not?
If I replaced it.
No, just imagine it's gone. Say you have an addiction to like drugs. Not you. Imagine you have an addiction to a drug.
Mm-hmm. That was me once.
Yeah? Did you kick it?
Yeah.
So, are you worse off or better?
Better.
Uh-huh. So now you're empty of that defilement.
But at first, when I did kick it, I was like empty, like in a bad way. Like I was like, what do I do? Like what do I do with myself? What do I do with my time?
Yeah,
like,
that's how it is.
And then it just kind of then just filled that emptiness with like joyful things.
Uh-huh. So you're better now?
Yeah.
So think of it that way.
Yeah.
If you get rid of your defilements, you're empty of your defilements. It doesn't mean you're a ghost. It means you don't have defilements.
I just like, okay, but then, okay, so for me, if I got rid of all these bad habits, but now instead of doing these bad habits, I do these good habits mainly. But then, like, I read a lot saying, like, Buddhism saying, like, doing nothing, you can be happy doing nothing, you know, you can just be happy being. And, like, I have to either be doing something, a bad habit or a good habit. I can't be doing no habits because
Yeah, well, your statement there is actually pretty insightful. The Buddha doesn't teach that. Just do nothing.
Okay.
He says, I don't even praise a standstill in wholesome qualities, much less a decline. I only praise growth in wholesome qualities. That's what the Buddha said. So it's good. When you give up something bad, you do something good. You don't just stay still. That's almost like declining. So what you said was correct.
Okay, cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Not a ghost. But what about like, like non-self? When I hear that, that's like the ultimate ghost in my head. That's just like what do you mean? Like, what do you mean? There's no personality. There's no attributes. There's no traits. Like, what are you then?
Right. So think of it this way. Have you ever had somebody in your life who you really cared about and then you lost?
Like a friendship breakup or death?
Anything.
Yeah.
Yeah? Now suppose somebody you don't know you lose them. Will you be sad? No? We create a sense of self around the things that we like. If we think that this is my friend, I have this relationship with them, we've created a self that's a friend. If something happens to our friend, we suffer a lot. So think of not self as being letting go of your creation, of who you are, in terms of things that are going to fall away. So if you've let go of those things, it's like being the person who doesn't know somebody and that person dies or gets sick. They don't suffer because of it, because it's not theirs.
That doesn't sound entirely appealing. Then what are you doing if you're not feeling sad over a friend's death or a friendship dissolving or something like that, and there's no feeling, then it's just like happy, so you go from happy knowing this person to just a continuous straight line of happy once they've died. Like, how does it that make sense?
There's different types of happiness, right?
Yeah.
So you have to imagine that there's the type of happiness that you get when you get something externally that you like. When you get it, does it last long?
No.
That's one type of happiness. Another type of happiness is the type of happiness that you get from meditation. That one's harder to imagine. You got to practice to experience it. But it doesn't depend on external things. The third type of happiness is the happiness that you get when you eliminate your defilements. That's the happiness of emptiness. So you don't have to think about, what's happening. At least leave your imagination open that there's types of happiness that are much, much better than than like the one somebody gets from a movie or whatever. You can leave your mind open to that.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's something I have to get my head around. But I guess I don't know, it's like I had this experience recently where I was so at first, like, it was going really, really well, and I was feeling good, like, this mindfulness is good, like, I'm feeling good, and then it, like, started not feeling good, like, I was feeling, like, anxious. I was like, what am I doing, like, it was just, like, it was almost like I was going numb upstairs, and it was, like, just bizarre, so I just, like, I don't know, I panicked a bit, and I was like, what's going on, am I, like, losing my mind? So I started doing a few more things, like I put like reading back into it, not all the other stuff, like I've cut out TV shows and whatnot, but it was just like, I don't know, like I'm probably just not like at a point where I can do that.
No problem. I'll tell you what, any meditation questions after the session, we can chat about it.
Okay.
I'll just take one more question because it's about 8:30. If anybody has any about the history.
I just got a message from Tina that there's a question on YouTube.
Oh. Yeah, see, I can't read it. I don't even know how to operate these things. What's the question? Did Tina say? So, this is like my YouTube and Tina's telling me.
Could you send it in the chat maybe?
Yeah, good understand. Yeah, okay, I'll ask.
It's getting really technical. It should be easy for me to just go look at the thing, but yeah? Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. If she sends it, that's good. If not, yeah, no worries. Yeah, it's okay. I'm not that kind of savvy either. If Eugene figures it out, that's okay. If not, does anybody else have any questions? Yeah?
So, the purpose of getting people in the discussion, where this sect increase the number by saying like no practice, but like reading or studying. So the purpose was that it was easy for people to do, therefore they would join that sect, or what was like, was it stop people practicing so they would progress, or what was that?
I don't think it was like evil. I mean, have you ever been in an argument with somebody? Or like a war? Have you seen the way that wars escalate historically? Do you know how World War I started? It was like something that's so obscure, like somebody didn't like this archduke and they assassinated him and the whole world ended up going to war. So, I mean, the way that these conflicts escalate into things that are so bitterly fought is, it's a study in human hatred and human greed. So that's the kind of thing that you're seeing at play here. We don't know how it escalated or what the first stone that got thrown was. We just know that this is actually a perennial issue. It was happening in the time of the Buddha. It happened in Sri Lanka, but it happened in Sri Lanka with this really bad result. The other thing is that, yes, it is, one thing that you see in modern times is that, especially in Theravada countries, people study, but to learn something through study, you only have to study it once. Like, I still remember stuff from when I was in business school. Like, I could still talk about it. I could still talk about business today and the principles behind business. I haven't done anything to do with business for, for my whole life, but I can still talk about it. I can't do it. So it's much easier to study a text once. I mean, you can go to Sunday Dhamma school for your young life, and then it's like you know the Dhamma. But what tends to happen is people do this study, which is relatively easy, and they can't keep the 5 precepts. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. Like the Buddha has said, to be a learned expert on the Dhamma, you should practice a 4-line stanza. I mean, to be a learned expert on the Dhamma, you've got to keep the 5 precepts. If you can't keep the 5 precepts, you are not an expert on the Dhamma. Your knowledge of the Dhamma is very low. It doesn't matter if you've memorized the whole Abhidhamma Pitaka, the whole Sutta Pitaka, you can't keep the 5 precepts. So what are we talking about here? So that's something that I would emphasize. In modern Theravada countries now, because of this event, there has been this culture that's developed where people study, they don't keep the precepts, they don't practice meditation, they give dana, which is excellent, right? I mean, that's very good. They study, they give dana, they don't keep the precepts, don't practice meditation. So it's not the worst thing. I mean, if you give dana and don't keep the precepts, then you can get reborn as like a dog, right? It's not as bad as going to hell. But much better is to get reborn as a human or to go to heaven. And to do that, you have to keep the precepts. So I think in response to your question, yes, there is that element. It's easier to study than practice. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I got a question, Banda. So it's not from Tina, someone from the YouTube chat.
Okay.
They're asking, hi Bante, I'm curious why the practice movements of Thai forest, Burmese Vipassana, and Sri Lankan, arose around the same time.
Yeah, it's really mysterious. So here's an interesting prophecy that's in the Burmese version of the commentary, which was that Arahantship would decline by 500-year increments from the time of the Buddha, but that in the middle period of his dispensation, which is supposed to last 500 years, there would be this revival. And then it would start to decline again. So that's their prophecy, and that's kind of, I don't know, I don't really believe that limitation, but about the 2,500-year mark, all these things kind of spontaneously arose. It's hard to say why.
And I have heard that Bhante, it's just coming only once, and then it declines again. So
Yeah.
the window might be very short.
Yeah, we can't say. Should be aware of that danger, right, and take full advantage. Yeah. Okay, so I think we've reached 8:30. So very nice to meet with everybody and to discuss Buddhist history. So if anybody has any other questions or something like this, I'll be available to chat, but I think I better wrap it up for those who have to go home. Okay.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Okay.
On behalf of the Buddhist Library and everyone present, we'd like to thank Bhante Joe for tonight's teaching. A reminder that all Buddhist Library events are offered by dana or donation. Part of the dana you give goes to the teacher to help them continue their efforts to spread the Dharma. And part of the dana you give goes to support and maintain the library and help us keep putting on more events. Next week we invite you to join us for Bhante Ananda, who will be giving a talk on the Eightfold Path, the original meditation technique taught by the Buddha. Thank you for being here tonight. We hope the teaching has been beneficial and have a safe trip home.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very we stop this?
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Vincent. Yeah, bye.